Hi there, Booktube. It's Ros. It's the 30th of January. It's Sunday, and I've realised I really ought to do my January delights, discoveries, and any disappointments wrap-up video because, well, I know I'm not going to finish another book between now and tomorrow evening, so it's a good time to do it. I just need something a little bit kind of lackluster today, and I might not be as sparkly as I think I usually am, but I've read some really interesting books this month, and I didn't want to miss out on doing a sharing some of that with you. Yeah, so I'm going for it. Now, I read 15 different books this month. But some of those are going to get some more space elsewhere, in another video. So I'm not going to really talk about all 15. I'll sort of just whisk through the ones I'm not really going to talk about here and get down to the ones that I am. First up, this is this month's play that I'm going to be talking about with Tilly. Now, hurrah, lucky Ros, Tilly's coming to visit in a couple of days' time, and so she and I'll be able to talk about this in person rather than in a Zoom call. So we're delaying it to the very beginning of February, but coming soon. 6 characters in Search of an Author by Pirandello. So I'm not talking about that now. The other thing that I have done this month, which I said I was going to do, was have a go at reading some more graphic novels. And the wonderful, lovely Lindy of Lindy's Magpie Reads recommended 3 graphic novels to kind of get me going, as it were, really sort of help me get into the comic format more. And these were the 3 I read: Fun Home, Alison, Bechdel, The Arrival by Shaun Tan, and This One Summer by Jillian and Mariko, Tamaki, or Tamaki. Yeah, I should check, shouldn't I? And lovely Lindy has said that she and I can get together again, and I'll give her a bit of feedback on how I found these, and she'll recommend a few more for me to read next. So watch out for that, probably in about a week's time. But just to whet your appetite, I will say that of those 3, one was a 3-star, one was a 4-star, and one was a downright 5-star read. But I'm not going to tell you which yet. Wait till I'm talking to Lindy. Okay. Now, my top book of the month, was Mehmed My Hawk by Yaşar Kemal, and this was an absolute delight. It's a book written in the 1950s by a Turkish author. It's kind of like a classic of Turkish literature, 20th century literature, and I was lucky enough to read it with Berna of Berna's Bookish Adventures, and so Berna read it in the original Turkish and I read it in English, and we, so that really broadened the experience for me in a wonderful way. Berna's already put up a video on her Turkish bookshelf sort of series about the book, but she and I are going to do a Zoom chat to sort of share what we liked or thought about it together. So I will say no more about that one, other than it was a stunner. Okay, so if you're at all interested in classics that are not from, the sort of West European canon, watch out for me talking about it with Berna, or go and watch Berna's video, which I'll link to below. Really fine book. Now, the final book that I'm not going to go into any detail about is Chaka by Thomas Mofolo. Which was translated by, what was the name? Kunene, Daniel Kunene, a relatively new translation. Now, if I tell you that Chaka is historical fiction that was written about 100 years ago, about events 100 years before that, by a writer from Lesotho, I think you will guess that I'll be doing a scallydandling video about that one, because it's a classic scallydandling read for me, a book by an author from a country that I've never read anything from before, and that really kind of gave me a different aspect, perspective, set of ideas. Yeah, so watch out for that one. Well, with that lot out of the way, that leaves me with 9 out of my 15 books to talk about in a little bit more detail. 6 novels, 2 books of poetry, and 1 book of non-fiction. Now, the book of non-fiction and 1 of the books of poetry I have here because these 2 kind of compete for the title of what was the most physically or visually delightful book that I read this month. Here they are. Okay, so we've got the Screaming Sky. That's a bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? By Charles Foster, and The Owl and the Nightingale by Simon Armitage, or it's oh well, I'll explain in a sec why it's not exactly by Simon Armitage, but is. Both about birds, not really, well, sort of. This one is absolutely about birds. This is the book of non-fiction, and why do I say it was a physical object of loveliness? It's kind of one of those like little books that's got, look at that lovely cover, and it's got wonderful pictures in it of birds because it is a book about swifts, or I suppose perhaps to be more precise, it's really a book about one man's almost dangerous levels of obsession with swifts, and in particular common swifts, not alpine swifts or Asian swifts, but common swifts. He's really they are he seems to sort of, I don't know what his wife and family make of it, but his level of obsession about these birds is that he will, like fly off to Gibraltar to sit on the cliffs there and watch for when the swifts come over, and he obsesses about the swifts that come and make their nests in summer to breed in under the eaves of his house, well, in the roof of his house, sort of in the whole series. But it is a book that is absolutely jam-packed, really, really interesting facts and ideas about swifts in quite poetically written, but also sort of just like, well, a trip into somebody else's weird psyche. I've heard about this book because Bob the Bookerer read it and talked about it, and I commented about how it sounded really intriguing and my sort of book. So dear kind Bob, instead of sending it to a charity shop, sent it to me. Much appreciated, thank you. And in the spirit of that, now I read it, I'm going to post it to Basel in Switzerland, to a friend there who's a bit obsessed about birds, if we're honest. He won't watch this, so I can say that. And he was the first person to show me an alpine swift as opposed to a common swift and explain the difference. So this book's going travelling again. That was a good book. An even better book for me, and definitely the one that wins the most beautiful visually book of the month, is The Owl and the Nightingale, and it's just full of the most gorgeous illustrations. This is a book of poetry, a long book of poetry. It's actually it's a new translation or retelling in poetry as a poem by the poet Simon Armitage of an old English poem. We don't know exactly who wrote it. We don't know exactly when it was first written. There's a couple of copies of it still existing. It was written in Middle English, so it's from the 12th century, we think. It's unusual. It's funny. It's set up as like a debate between the owl and the nightingale, and it's they're kind of arguing with each other. It was a 5-star read for me. I really enjoyed it. It's my sort of thing. Wouldn't be for everybody though, I know, but the extraordinary beauty of it as well kind of helped would help carry anyone through, I think. Yeah, if you're not afraid of something a little strange. The other book of poetry I read this month was this one, Night by David Harsent. And what I will say briefly about this is that this is very good poetry by any objective standard, but I didn't love it. And I think that I didn't love it, even though I could, I could feel the quality. I really could. I could feel the quality. He writes, beautifully. 2011, this came out, and he's a well-respected poet. But there's something almost slightly nasty about some of the poems in this book. I sort of found myself thinking, I wonder if he's, I don't know. I wouldn't want to be his wife. I wouldn't want to have been this man's wife because he was always running off to look at swifts, but he seems like quite a nice guy. This one I felt like, I'm not sure you are a nice guy. Well, why should a poet be? But somehow some of the way he writes in places about relationships and people and women just made me weirdly uneasy. Although it's not explicitly sort of misogynist, just, I don't know. I'd be really interested if anyone else has read this to hear what you thought about that, really, and whether my reaction was a peculiar one. There are some wonderful, there's also some wonderful, and there were some poems in here that I did love, but something about the alarm bells went off in my head for some of them. There we go. Now, let's get to the novels, the six lovely novels. Now, I'm going to start with one that was undiluted pleasure, a true delight. Okay, and that I don't have to wave to you because I read it as an ebook, but it's Lonely Graves by Britta Bolt. Now, Britta, is that name strangely familiar? Yes, it is. This is part of my reading books by Booktubers kind of little project that I've been pursuing, and Britta Bolt, the booktuber, writes under the pseudonym Britta Bolt with another writer, Rodney Bolt, when she's writing crime fiction rather than her own novels that she writes by herself. Yeah. And do you know how it is when how do we decide if a book is a good book? How do you decide, oh, this is 5-star, this is top rated for me? One of the ways that a book gets into that place for me is if it's a book that does exactly what it sets out to do really, really well. And that's what The Lonely Graves does, because it's crime fiction, and I can tell that Britta obviously loves crime fiction. She's obviously read lots of crime fiction, and she's just, set to write a spot on, really good quality crime novel. It's got, characters that you want to kind of connect to and stay. I want to read the next one in the series. I'm hooked on these people. I want to know more about their lives. It's got a lively plot with little mysteries and things that get explained, and things that it's got oodles of atmosphere. It's set in Amsterdam, and I love Amsterdam, so it just it ticked all the boxes for me for crime fiction. So thank you, Britta. Now, the next book I'm going to talk about was definitely a discovery, and a good one, a really good one. But not a sort of unmitigated delight to read for reasons that I'll explain. Not because it was bad, but because it was ominous and difficult in a way. And yes, discovery. And that is Going to the Dogs by Erich Kästner. Now, if you have heard of Erich Kästner before, unless you're German or very well read, you will probably know him for his children's books, particularly Emil and the Detectives, which is one of my all-time favourite children's books. And I said that in a video one time, and Amelia of Amelia Reads, who's like a Bookstagrammer, and she's a booktube commenter and does stuff on Instagram, she kind of commented, oh, have you ever read any of his work for adults? And told me that she really loves his writing for adults. And we kind of agreed that we would read Going to the Dogs, as it is that's its English title. In German, it's published as Fabian, which is the name of the main character. And yeah, we agreed to read together. And as with Berna, I was reading an English translation. Who was the translation by, I should say, shouldn't I? It's always good. Rodney Livingstone. There we go. And she was reading it in the original German. We were both reading a modern version, not the slightly expurgated version that first came out in 1931. The more recent versions have bits put back in that were taken out. Now, if you've read Emil and the Detectives and you think that's what Erich Kästner is like, you're in for a bit of a shock with this one. Okay, this is definitely an adult book, but a brilliant one, a really fascinating read. And thank you, Amelia, for getting me to read it. It was published in 1931. It's set in Berlin mostly, in probably about 1929, 1930. You know what was happening in Berlin at that point. You know, it's Weimar Republic. It's sort of morals were very loose. You know, there was a lot of experiment and wildness going on, a lot of art and so on. And at the same time, you know, the political situation was deteriorating. There was sort of violence, unemployment, and, you know, potentially social collapse was on its way. And Kästner obviously was very sensitive to all of that. This book there's an element of kind of caricature about it. At times it's almost grotesque. At other times it's quite tender or melancholy. The writing is beautiful. I think reading it in German it would be even more beautiful. I felt Amelia really made me regret that I couldn't read it in German when she talked about how the language works and so on. It's a warm recommendation from me, but this is not a happy book. You know, you've got to be ready for that. And, you know, would you expect it to be? And it's even more poignant when you know that by 1933, Kästner was standing in the middle of Berlin, seeing it burnt, along with many other books by the Nazis. So, yeah, there's a whole story around the book that is interesting too. That was that. Now, the next novel that I'm going to talk about was, you know, I usually say, oh, this book was a delight, or this book was a discovery, or this book was a disappointment. Okay, this one managed to be a delight and a discovery and a disappointment all in one book. Okay, what to say about The House of Leaves by Marc Danielewski. It's a strange book. It's experimental. In places, it kind of things go all over the place. I have to say, there's half the book seems to be footnotes and appendices. It's multi-layered. It purports to be the second edition with editor's notes of a book written by a youngish man called Johnny, who was having something of a breakdown, who was writing the book based, sort of transcribing the manuscript of an elderly blind man who'd recently died, who'd written a book about a cult film made by a famous photographer, supposedly, and his wife, who'd bought a house and found a sort of weird inner labyrinth rooms inside that house in kind of horror come fantasy sort of mode, and people die, and you never know what's true or what's not true at any point. It had moments that were intense and really engaging, but there were other aspects to the book. Well, you know me, I enjoy an experimental book, but there was almost too much of a game about this one. You know, it was a sort of book where you needed to get the most out of it. You needed to think, oh, that diary entry and that footnote has got the same date as that letter from his mother that's in the appendix. You know, you have to have that kind of brain that really loves that sort of intellectual game playing. And it was a group read organised by Sina of Beating Around the Books. And I think there were other people in the group that got more into that unpicking and that sort of that intellectual game than I did. Fraser Simons, who I hope you know, has made some really good videos about this. So if you're really interested in this book, go and watch Fraser's videos and ignore me. But now, I may be wrong, but there was something a bit sort of like, look at me, I'm clever about this book that didn't completely win my heart. Okay, that's what I would say. But not a disappointment. That would be far too simplistic to say about that book. Well, that was House of Leaves. 3 novels to go. Next one, Delight again. Nice, straightforward, wholehearted recommendation from me. And that's A Long Way from Douala by Max Lobe, translated by Schwartz from the French. Lobe is a writer from Cameroon. This book was written in 2018. I was reading it because the Africa Cup of Nations is on at the moment, and Marc at Booktown with Elvis, in each football tournament, he arranges a sort of fun reading challenge linked to the football tournament. Now, for most of the you have to read things by the team that beats your team each time. Yeah, it works. It's fun, and there's lots of chat. And mostly, I've been reading short stories from some African short story collections, or bits of African bits of poetry from the relevant African nations that were taking part in the tournament. But Cameroon is the host nation, so I thought I definitely need to kick off by reading a book from Cameroon. So picked A Long Way from Douala. I picked A Long Way from Douala partly because football is a strong theme in the book, or not so much football, but the way hopes and dreams about football are a sort of create an aspiration for a better life, or a hope of success in the West for some young men in Cameroon. And that's what happens to the protagonist's brother. And he sort of disappears, and he's following the route to be sort of to try and make the journey to France, kind of up through Africa, from Cameroon into Nigeria and so on, and all that, all of that. It's not a long book. It's quite, in fact, I could show it to you, couldn't I? Why am I not showing it to you? It's not a huge book, but it packs a real punch. It's a book about families, really, and bereavement, and yes, and sibling relationships, and what happens when parents treat their children differently, have favourites, what impact does that have, and more than anything else, and in many ways the loveliest thing about this book is it's a gay coming of age novel, and that's sort of that was the icing on the cake in terms of the emotional satisfaction of this book. It's lovely. Yeah, definitely a good strong 4-star strong recommendation book, this one, particularly if you'd like to read something from Cameroon, and that's, yeah, takes you there. Yeah. The next book, last but one I'm going to talk about, is an older book, and that's The Guide by R.K. Narayan. That came out in 1958. It was written in English, but it's an Indian book. He Narayan always wrote in English. He wrote, I think, what he's known for is he wrote a whole series of books that are all set in the town of Malgudi, which is a kind of a fictional small town in southern India, and the books are all separate, and they're not like you could read any of them in any order, but they are all sensitive, funny, perceptive, kind of character-based stories, full of incident, and with a kind of, that kind of quirky small town thing going on. If you've never read any Narayan, I would, again, this is definitely a recommendation, not discovery for me, because I have read some of his books in the past, but I haven't read one for ages, and so it was like a rediscovery of like, oh God, this is great. This particular one, the guide, is about someone who kind of falls into becoming a tourist guide, and then kind of gets into trouble, ends up in prison, when he comes out of prison, he accidentally becomes identified as a holy man, and then sort of almost decides that he has to live up to that for the village that he's found himself in. It's cleverly constructed, sort of unmitigated good book, basically. Which brings me to my last book, the last book that I read in January, and the last book that I'm going to talk about. And that's A Terrible Kindness by Jo Browning Wroe. And this book was published this month, so 20th of January, I think it came out in the UK. It may not be out in America yet, because it's Browning Wroe is an English author. I wanted to read this book because it's a debut novel by an older woman, and I'm always interested by debut novels by people particularly women who've had a bit of a life first and then decide to write a novel. There's something about that I don't know, intrigues me, and I am really glad that I read this book. It's a discovery in the sense that I now know that I can really enjoy a book whose main character is an embalmer. Who knew? That's really central to the story. She grew up in a crematorium, as it happens, so she sort of was drawing on her own past, but then she's not an embalmer. She worked in publishing, so she's researched all that, and then she's writing what's essentially a kind of a family story. It's an impressive debut. Every now and then you think, oh, ouch, that sentence was a bit clunky, it's a bit first booky, but that's, I romped through it. It's one of those books, what I would say, and I was trying to think of, am I recommending something, and if so, how? I think this is a book that lots of people will absolutely love. I think it's going to be a 5-star book for lots of people. It wasn't for me, and if it wasn't for me, that was because it's too emotional. Not that I don't like emotional books, but when a book is sort of very much about, I don't know, emotional turmoil and some sort of, I don't know, slightly obvious journey that and it's slightly non-linear in how it's written, which is good, but you kind of, it starts with the big dramatic event. There's a moral issue about that, because it starts with him volunteering as an embalmer at the site of the Aberfan disaster, where like 116 children died when it's in a mining area, and there's basically this slurry kind of like just wiped out school, and it killed some adults and a huge number of children back in 1966 in Wales. Is it okay to use that as a sort of the thing to set up your novel? I think it is, but that sets the sort of I don't know, emotional temperature of the book, put it that way. But this is still, I would still say, it's not a disrecommendation, but just to bear that in mind, I suppose. That's my month. Have you had a brilliant month? I hope so. I'm going to stop here, but I would love to hear any comments about any of these that you've read too, and anything that you've read this month that you'd like to tell me about. That would be lovely.